Morning sunlight poured through the glass walls of the Mitchell residence, casting a golden reflection over the marble countertops and the vase of tulips Daniel had bought 2 days earlier. To anyone passing by their Beacon Hill townhouse, Clara and Daniel Mitchell looked like the very picture of success, a couple who had it all. Clara stood before the mirror, adjusting her silk blouse, watching her own reflection as if it were a stranger's. Her makeup was precise, deliberate, hiding the fatigue beneath her eyes. The faint sound of Daniel's footsteps echoed from the kitchen, steady, rhythmic, reassuring. He was making coffee, as he always did. Every morning, 6:45 sharp. 2 cups. 1 block, 1 with almond milk and 2 sugars, hers. She could tell the difference between his moods by how he stirred the spoon. Today, the sound was slow, methodical, distant. "Big meeting today?" Daniel asked, not looking up from the espresso machine. Clara smiled automatically, the way she had learned to in her PR firm when cameras turned her way. "You could say that," she replied. "We're pitching to a new tech client. Big budget, high stakes." He nodded, the corners of his lips lifting slightly. That polite, careful half-smile of his, the one that used to make her feel safe, but now just reminded her of everything she wasn't saying. She wanted to tell him she hadn't slept, that she'd lain awake next to him, staring at the ceiling, her phone hidden under the pillow, rereading a message from someone who wasn't her husband. "Can't stop thinking about you." Counting hours till we're alone again. Instead, she kissed Daniel's cheek lightly, an act rehearsed through routine, and whispered, "Wish me luck." He said, "Always." When the door closed behind her, she let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Outside, Boston was alive, the city humming with ambition, coffee cups and silent loneliness. Clara blended in effortlessly, heels clicking on cobblestone streets, designer bag over her shoulder. She looked like every other successful woman in the financial district, except that her heart was split between guilt and desire. At the office, her assistant greeted her with a folder of proposals, but Clara's attention was already drawn to the glass door at the end of the hallway, the one that led to his office. Richard Hayes, senior partner, mid-40s, charming, confident, with the kind of presence that filled a room before he even spoke. It started with compliments during late meetings, turned into lunches, and eventually into something neither of them could define or stop. When she entered, he looked up from his desk, eyes glinting beneath the morning light. "You look incredible," he said softly. "Don't," she whispered, shutting the door behind her. "We said we'd be careful." He smiled, that same disarming grin that had undone her defenses months ago. "Careful doesn't mean invisible, Clara." She wanted to resist, but the way he said her name like a secret made her pulse quicken. For a brief, reckless moment, she forgot about Daniel, about the life waiting at home built on promises she no longer believed in. It was supposed to be simple, a distraction, something that made her feel alive again. But every touch, every stolen glance was another thread unraveling the life she had so carefully constructed. Later that evening, Clara returned home to find Daniel still at his drafting table, blueprints spread across the surface, his sleeves rolled up, the faint smell of ink and coffee surrounding him. "How was your day?" he asked, not looking up. She hesitated. "Exhausting. The pitch went well." "That's good." There was a pause. One of those quiet, heavy pauses that had become more common between them. Once they would have talked for hours about their dreams, their plans, the tiny things that made up their world. Now, even silence felt staged. Daniel finally glanced at her, his eyes calm but unreadable. "You've been distant lately," he said. Clara froze. "Just work," she lied. "Deadlines, stress." He nodded slowly, as if he wanted to believe her. "You know you can tell me anything, right?" Her throat tightened. The kindness in his voice was unbearable. It made the guilt sharper, heavier. "Of course," she managed. That night, she showered longer than usual, letting the hot water burn her skin as if it could wash away the scent of Richard's cologne still clinging faintly to her. When she stepped out, Daniel was already in bed, reading. The soft light from the nightstand fell across his face, the same face she had once promised to love, to protect, to never hurt. She climbed in beside him, careful not to disturb his peace, pretending to read her phone while her heart battled itself in silence. Daniel reached over, brushed a strand of hair from her forehead, and said softly, "You're somewhere else tonight." Clara turned off the lamp. "Just tired," she murmured. But when darkness settled over the room, her eyes stayed open. In her mind, two lives ran parallel, one of a devoted wife, the other of a woman trapped in her own deceit. And as she lay there listening to Daniel's breathing beside her, a single thought echoed in her chest like a confession she would never say aloud. "I built a perfect lie, and now I have to live inside it."
The first fracture came quietly, the kind that doesn't shatter a life all at once, but starts as a whisper, an almost imperceptible crack in the glass. It was a Thursday night in late autumn. Boston's air carried that crisp scent of dying leaves, and the city lights shimmered like distant fires beyond their living room window. Daniel sat at his drafting table, tracing the final lines of a client's renovation project. Clara, across the room, was on her laptop, pretending to work but actually reading a message she shouldn't have opened. "Can't wait to see you tomorrow. Same hotel, same time. I missed you today." Her pulse stuttered. The thrill she used to feel had faded, replaced with a cold wave of anxiety. She deleted the message immediately, but her hands trembled as she typed a reply. "Can't talk now. Daniel's home." She didn't realize he was watching her. Daniel's gaze lingered for a moment, not accusatory, not even suspicious, just quietly observant. "You're working late again," he said finally. She forced a smile. "Big campaign coming. You know how it is." He nodded and went back to his sketches. But something had changed. The silence between them wasn't just quiet, it was listening. The next day, Clara woke before dawn, dressing in her usual perfection, a cream blouse, fitted skirt, red lipstick. Daniel was still asleep, his arm draped across the empty half of the bed. She kissed his forehead gently, a gesture that used to mean love, now just habit, and whispered, "See you tonight." Except he wouldn't. By noon, she was in Richard's suite, high floors, city view, curtains half closed. The luxury of secrecy. She tried to focus on him, on the intensity that once made her feel seen, desired. But the spark had dulled. Every touch felt borrowed, every word rehearsed. When she left, she caught her reflection in the elevator mirror. Flawless makeup, trembling eyes. The woman looking back at her wasn't the one she wanted to be. She didn't notice the faint sound of a camera click from the lobby. That evening, when she returned home, Daniel wasn't in the living room. The house felt heavier than usual. On the dining table lay her phone, open, face down. Her heart froze. She had left it in her bag. "Daniel?" she called out, her voice too casual. He appeared from the hallway, calm, almost unnaturally so. He held a small printed photograph in his hand, glossy, recent. Richard and Clara, the hotel lobby, her hand brushing his arm. The kind of photo that didn't lie. For a moment, time fractured. The ticking clock became deafening. "Where did you get that?" she whispered. Daniel looked at her with eyes she couldn't read. Not anger, not even sorrow. Something deeper. Something empty. "It was emailed to me. No name, no message. Just this." Her mind raced. Who would... Richard? No, he was too careful. Someone at the office? The front desk? None of it mattered. "Daniel, I can explain," she began, but her voice broke halfway through the sentence. He set the photo down gently, as though afraid of breaking it, or perhaps afraid of breaking what was left of himself. "Explain what, Clara? That you were unhappy? That I didn't make you feel alive?" Tears welled in her eyes. "It didn't mean to..." His tone was soft, but it sliced through her words like glass. "You planned meetings, messages, hotel rooms. You meant every moment." She took a step forward, desperate.
Please, Daniel, it didn't mean anything. I swear to you, it's over. He looked at her for a long time, too long, and then laughed quietly, a hollow, aching sound. You don't get to decide what it means, Clara. Not anymore. He turned away, his shoulders stiff, and she saw something terrifying in his composure. Not fury, but finality. The kind that doesn't explode. It just ends. That night he slept in the guest room. The walls between them might as well have been miles thick. I heard him moving, packing something. The sound of zippers, drawers closing softly. At 3 a.m, she got up and stood by the door, listening. He was writing something. I could hear the scratch of pen against paper. By sunrise, Daniel was gone. His side of the closet empty, his shoes missing from the rack. On the kitchen counter lay a single envelope with her name written in his handwriting. She opened it with trembling fingers. Clara, I thought I understood what love meant, that it was about forgiving flaws, surviving disappointment, trusting even when it hurts. But love dies when truth does. Don't call me. Don't look for me. I need to remember who I was before all this. Maybe one day, you will too. Her knees gave out and she sank to the floor, the letter trembling in her hands. Outside, the city kept moving. Cars, voices, sunlight, indifferent to the ruins inside her chest. She wanted to scream, to chase him, to explain, but there was nothing left to explain. The perfect lie had been exposed, and all that remained was silence, the kind that echoes long after a door closes.
For weeks after Daniel left, the house became a museum of his absence. His coffee mug still sat on the counter, a faint ring of dried espresso marking where he'd last placed it. His blueprints, those neat lines that once filled their dining table, lay untouched, curling slightly at the edges. Clara couldn't bring herself to move anything. It was as if by keeping the evidence of his life intact, she could somehow pretend he was still part of it. Every morning she woke to silence. The space beside her in bed was cool, the sheets undisturbed. Boston's skyline glowed faintly through the blinds. The same city that had once felt alive now felt like it was watching her, impersonal, judgmental. At work, she performed flawlessly. She smiled in meetings, presented to clients, laughed when required. Her colleagues praised her for her composure after a difficult time. No one knew what had actually happened. They just assumed Daniel had taken a job somewhere else, or that they were on a break. She never corrected them. But the nights were unbearable. She'd pour herself a glass of wine and scroll through old messages, rereading Daniel's words from years before, fragments of a love that felt like someone else's story now. Can't sleep without you here. Remember the cabin in Vermont? Let's go again next fall. Fall had come and gone. The cabin was probably still there, untouched, waiting for a couple that no longer existed. Sometimes she'd walk the streets of their neighborhood, convincing herself she might run into him by accident. She imagined seeing him at the corner cafe that used to go to, or in line at the bookstore where he loved to browse architecture journals. But he was nowhere. Not on social media, not in mutual friends updates, not even a trace on LinkedIn. It was as though Daniel Mitchell had simply been erased. One evening, about a month after he'd left, Clara came home to find a thick envelope wedged beneath her door. No return address. Inside were the divorce papers, already signed on his end. No note, no explanation, just the mechanical closure of something that had once been sacred. Her lawyer called the next day. "It's clean, straightforward," he said, his voice businesslike. "He's not asking for anything. Property, accounts, all in your name. Honestly, you're lucky." Lucky. The word hung in the air like an insult. She signed the papers that night. Her signature trembled slightly, the ink smudging where her tears hit the page. When she dropped the envelope into the mailbox the next morning, it felt like dropping a piece of her own soul into an abyss.
By winter, Daniel's disappearance had turned from grief into obsession.
She began searching quietly, through old contacts, mutual friends, even a few of his former clients. No one had heard from him. Daniel? One colleague said, frowning. Didn't he move to Seattle? Another shrugged. Last I heard, he was taking time off. Maybe traveling? Clara nodded, smiled politely, and walked away. Each guess another door that led nowhere. At night, she dreamed of Daniel. In those dreams, Daniel wasn't angry. He just stood in the doorway, the same soft eyes, the same quiet voice, asking, "Why are you still looking for me?" She'd wake with her heart racing, reaching for a phone that never rang. Then came the storm. Late February, the kind that blankets the city in white silence. Clara stood by the window, watching snow fall over the streetlights, thinking of how Daniel used to love nights like this. He'd make cocoa, play old jazz records, and they'd sit on the couch wrapped in a blanket, saying nothing, just being. That night, the house felt unbearably empty. She poured herself another drink, then another, until the edges of her thoughts blurred. In a drunken haze, she dialed his old number, the one she'd promised herself she'd deleted. The line rang once, twice, then, "This number is no longer in service." The robotic voice sliced through her chest. She threw the phone onto the couch, buried her face in her hands, and let out a sound she hadn't allowed herself in months. A raw, aching cry that filled the entire house. It wasn't just the loss of Daniel. It was the loss of who she had been when she was with him. The woman who believed in a version of herself that could be loved, trusted, forgiven. Spring arrived quietly. The city thawed, but Clara remained frozen inside her own winter. She told herself she'd move on. She started running again, repainted the living room, even went out with friends. Outwardly, she was fine, but at night, she still replayed that final morning. His note, the stillness, the echo of a door closing. Sometimes she wondered if Daniel had meant for it to be this way, if disappearing completely was his final punishment. Not shouting, not revenge, just absence. And in that silence, she began to realize something frightening. It wasn't just that Daniel was gone. It was that he had taken with him every version of her that had ever been true. When she finally looked in the mirror months later, Clara barely recognized the woman staring back. There was something missing in her eyes. Not sadness, but emptiness. The kind that comes when you've lived too long in guilt and silence. She whispered to her reflection, as though testing the sound of her own name. Clara Mitchell. It felt foreign. The woman Daniel had loved no longer existed. The one who remained was a ghost, pacing through the ruins of a life she'd built on lies, waiting, always waiting, for a man who no longer wanted to be found.
Time didn't heal Clara Mitchell. It only dulled the edges of her wounds, like waves polishing a stone that never quite loses its shape. 3 years had passed since Daniel vanished, and though her life appeared intact on the surface, she lived as if in exile from herself. She had moved from their old Beacon Hill townhouse into a sleek apartment overlooking the Charles River. The place was bright, modern, efficient, the kind of home that said, "I'm fine now," to anyone who visited. Her colleagues believed her friends believed her. Even her mother, who called every Sunday, seemed reassured by Clara's calm voice and careful answers. But at night, when the city lights flickered on the water, Clara would sit by the window with a glass of wine, scrolling through old photos she couldn't delete. Daniel's face stared back, quiet, thoughtful, unknowable. There was no new relationship. She had tried a few dinners, a handful of dates, but every man she met felt like a stranger trying to occupy someone else's shadow. She became skilled at the art of emotional distance, smiling when necessary,
retreating when it got too real. People described her as graceful, poised, mysterious. None of them knew that her poise was just penance, a way of hiding the chaos still burning inside. Her career, however, had flourished. Pain had a strange way of sharpening her instincts. Clara had risen to become a senior PR strategist at one of Boston's top firms. Her clients trusted her to fix reputations, to smooth over scandals, to rewrite messy truths into polished narratives. Spin the story, save the image. It was ironic, really. She made a living crafting lies that made people look innocent. Every time she shaped a client's crisis into something more palatable, she saw her own reflection in their shame. She wondered if she was trying to redeem herself through other people's mistakes. One afternoon, after a particularly draining meeting, Clara found herself alone in the office break room. Her colleague Sarah, younger and bright-eyed, joined her with a smile. "You know," Sarah said, "I can't imagine you ever making a mistake. You're so composed, like nothing can touch you." Clara smiled faintly. "Everyone makes mistakes." "Not like the rest of us," Sarah laughed. "You're bulletproof." When Sarah laughed, Clara stared at the reflection in the microwave door, her face calm, perfect, unreadable. Bulletproof. If only she knew. That night, Clara couldn't sleep. She walked to the closet, opened a box she hadn't touched in years, the one that held Daniel's letter. The paper had yellowed slightly at the edges. She unfolded it carefully, tracing his handwriting with her fingertips. "Don't call me. Don't look for me." She whispered the words aloud, as if reciting a prayer she couldn't stop believing in. But beneath the pain, something else had begun to grow. A need for closure, or maybe punishment. She had accepted Daniel's absence, but not the mystery of it. Where had he gone? Did he ever think of her? Did he still hate her, or worse, had he forgotten she ever existed? It was that last thought that haunted her most.
Months turned into seasons. On what would have been their 8th anniversary, Claire visited the small cafe they used to frequent. The same barista was there, older now but still smiling warmly. "Long time, Ms. Mitchell. The usual?" She nodded, though the usual had once been their drink. One almond milk cappuccino, one black coffee. The barista made both without asking, setting them down on the counter as if Daniel were still beside her. "Still taking two?" he asked. Clara hesitated. "No," she said softly. "Just one now." She sat by the window watching couples pass on the street, laughing, touching hands, the small gestures that once felt ordinary but now seemed like sacred rituals she no longer deserved. The cappuccino went cold before she took a sip. That night, a storm rolled over the city. Wind howled through the narrow streets and rain lashed against her windows like restless ghosts. Clara poured herself another glass of wine, then another, until her restraint dissolved. She opened her laptop, logged into an old email account she hadn't touched since the divorce. Daniel's contacts still saved under D. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. "I'm sorry." She typed the words, stared at them, then deleted them. What could she possibly say after all these years? There was no address to send it to, anyway. But the thought wouldn't let her go. She began searching online. Daniel Mitchell, Boston architect. No results. She refined it. Daniel Mitchell, Vermont cabin. Still nothing. It was as though he'd never existed. Then, in a moment of impulsive desperation, she clicked on a private investigator's website, one her firm had once hired for a corporate background check. The bold tagline stared back at her. "Because everyone leaves a trace." Clara's heart pounded. For a long time, she just sat there, staring at the words. Then, with trembling hands, she filled out the contact form. Subject, missing person inquiry. She hesitated before typing his name. Daniel Mitchell.
In the message box, she wrote, "I'm looking for someone I used to know. I don't need him to come back. I just need to know he's okay." She hit send before she could change her mind. The rain outside eased into a whisper. She closed her laptop and leaned back, her eyes heavy but awake. For the first time in years, she felt something like movement. Not hope exactly, but the faint stir of a truth she wasn't sure she was ready to face. In the dark, the city lights flickered across her walls like ghosts. And somewhere, beneath the layers of guilt and time, Clara realized she wasn't looking for Daniel anymore. She was looking for the part of herself that disappeared with him.
For years, Olivia had managed to bury the truth beneath a carefully curated life. A new city, new job, and an almost convincing version of peace. But guilt has a way of whispering when the world goes quiet. On a cold Sunday morning, sitting alone in her apartment in Seattle, she stared at an old photograph of Daniel, the man she lied to, the man she drove away, and something in her finally broke. She found herself searching his name online, scrolling through social media, business listings, anything that might suggest where he was. There was nothing. It was as if Daniel had vanished completely after leaving New York. The emptiness of his digital absence cut deeper than any accusation ever could. For a man so precise, so grounded, to disappear entirely, it didn't make sense. After days of restless searching, Olivia contacted a private investigator named Marcus Hale, a calm, middle-aged man with the kind of tired eyes that had seen too many broken marriages. When she explained why she needed to find Daniel, Marcus studied her for a long moment before saying, "You're not looking for him, Ms. Reed. You're looking for forgiveness." The words struck her like a confession. Still, she handed him the retainer, $10,000, wired the same day. It was money she didn't really have, but she told herself it was a debt to the man she'd wronged. As Marcus began his search, Olivia revisited her own past. Every street corner, every cafe in Manhattan reminded her of Daniel. His hand on her back as they crossed Fifth Avenue, the quiet dinners in her apartment overlooking the Hudson. And yet under those memories lay a thread of deceit she could no longer untangle. Weeks turned into months. Each update from Marcus was a mix of hope and dread. Daniel had no known address, no employment record, no social accounts. Either he doesn't want to be found, or someone made sure he couldn't be. That night, Olivia couldn't sleep. The rain beat against her window as she stared at her reflection in the dark glass. A woman haunted not just by the man she lost, but by the possibility that her lie had destroyed far more than a marriage. Her search wasn't about closure anymore. It was about penance. And deep down, she feared that finding Daniel might finally reveal the truth she'd spent years running from. It was nearly 6 months after she hired Marcus when Olivia received his call. There was no greeting, no preamble, just a quiet, heavy pause before he said, "I found him." Her breath caught. She was in her office downtown, surrounded by the hum of computers and the faint smell of burnt coffee, but in that moment, the world shrank to silence. "Where?" she whispered. "Outside Portland, small town, goes by Daniel Harper now." She repeated the name to herself, Harper, the surname he once mentioned from his mother's side years ago. Marcus continued. "He teaches carpentry at a community college, seems quiet, keeps to himself." Olivia felt her pulse thrum in her ears. For years, she had imagined him gone, lost to the world, or worse. The image of him alive, living a different life, felt almost unbearable. Did he ever remarry?" she asked. Marcus hesitated. "No, but there's something else." A long silence. Olivia's hand trembled over the desk when she waited. "What is it?" "When he left New York, he wasn't running from you. He was running from the scandal you started." She frowned. "What do you mean?" Marcus slid a manila folder across the table when they met later that day. Inside were old news clippings, photographs, and legal documents, things she had never seen before.
Her affair had not only been the only thing to unravel their marriage. The company Daniel worked for had collapsed after a financial audit, one triggered by a confidential report. Her lie, the one she had told HR to protect herself, had named Daniel as complicit in falsifying accounts. It wasn't true, but the report had spread fast. He'd been forced out, humiliated, and blacklisted. He lost everything in a week, his job, his reputation, and then he disappeared. Olivia's chest tightened. She had thought she had only hurt him emotionally, not destroyed his entire life. Tears blurred the papers as she read the formal letter of termination, signed months before she even realized what her lie had done. That night, she drove back to her apartment in a haze. Every sound, the traffic outside, the ticking of her wall clock, felt sharp and accusing. She pulled out the photo of Daniel again, tracing his face with her thumb. She whispered into the empty room, "You were right to leave." But sleep never came. Instead, a single thought echoed in her mind. She hadn't come this far to find a ghost of her guilt. She needed to see him, not as the man she remembered, but as the one she had broken. And as dawn began to bleed across the skyline, Olivia made her decision. She was going to Portland.
The drive from Seattle to Portland stretched endlessly under a gray, restless sky. Rain smeared across the windshield, softening the landscape into ghostly blurs of forest and fog. Olivia hadn't slept. She had rehearsed every possible version of what she might say, apologies, explanations, even silence, but all of them collapsed under the weight of the same truth. There were no words that could undo what she had done. When she reached the small Oregon town Marcus had mentioned, she pulled over in front of a modest brick building that read Riverside Community College. The parking lot was nearly empty, save for a few old sedans and a pickup truck with worn paint. She sat there, staring at the rain-soaked glass doors, her heart pounding so loudly she could barely hear the wipers. Inside the workshop, the sound of wood being sawed and sanded filled the air. Marcus had said Daniel taught carpentry, and for a long moment she stood outside, watching through the wide window. There he was, older, leaner, with streaks of gray in his dark hair. He moved with quiet precision, his hands steady, his face calm in a way that unnerved her. He looked free. When their eyes finally met through the glass, Daniel froze. The saw went silent. Olivia stepped inside, her heels clicking softly against the cement floor. "Daniel," she said, her voice trembling. He blinked once, as if confirming she was real. "Daniel." His voice was quiet, controlled, but underneath it she heard something brittle. "What are you doing here?" "I needed to see you." "You've seen me. Now what?" I didn't know." "You didn't know what? That I lost everything? That your lie turned my life into a cautionary tale? Or that I spent years trying to convince myself I deserved it because I loved you too much to see what you really were?" Each word landed like a blade. Olivia took a step forward, tears stinging her eyes. "Daniel, please, I didn't mean for any of that to happen. I thought if I told them it was you, they'd stop the investigation. He laughed, low and bitter. "You thought throwing me under the bus would save you. And it did. You kept your job, your reputation. I was the one left with the wreckage." "I know. And I've lived with that every day since. I hired someone to find you because I couldn't live with the silence anymore. I needed to tell you I'm sorry." Daniel's expression shifted, not softening, but sinking into something wearier. "Do you think sorry is a currency that buys back a life, Olivia?" She shook her head. "No, but it's all I have." For a long, painful moment, neither of them spoke. The rain outside beat harder against the windows. Daniel turned away, staring at the rows of unfinished tables and shelves around them. "I built these," he said finally.
every piece by hand. Took me years to stop building things just to fill the silence. I ruined you, she said softly. He turned back to her, eyes cold but glistening. No, you broke me. There's a difference. Broken things can still be rebuilt, just not the same. Olivia reached into her bag and pulled out an envelope, Marcus's report, the documents that detailed everything she'd learned. I wanted to give you this, she said, so you'd know I finally saw what I did. He looked at it but didn't take it. I don't need evidence of your guilt. I lived it. Then take it as proof that I finally understand, that I'll carry this for the rest of my life. Daniel exhaled, long and slow, as if trying to let something go, but finding it too heavy. He finally took the envelope, not out of forgiveness, but finality. He opened it, scanned a few pages, and set it down on the nearest table. When I left New York, I thought I'd never want to see you again. But seeing you now, it doesn't feel like hate anymore. Just exhaustion. Olivia felt tears stream down her face. If I could trade places with the man you were before all this— You can't, he interrupted quietly. That man died the day you lied. The workshop filled with silence again, heavy but clean, like a wound that had finally stopped bleeding. She nodded slowly, wiping her tears. Then let me go, Daniel. Let both of us go. He looked at her for a long time, the rain catching in the light outside, the scent of sawdust and regret hanging thick in the air. Finally, he said, I already did, a long time ago. Olivia turned toward the door, her vision blurring as she walked away. Outside, the rain had stopped. The world smelled of wet earth and beginnings she no longer deserved. When she reached her car, she looked back once. Through the workshop window, Daniel stood exactly where she had left him. Still, composed, unreadable. He wasn't hers anymore. Hadn't been for years. As she started the engine, she realized the truth that shattered her wasn't his forgiveness or his indifference. It was knowing that the man she once destroyed had learned to rebuild, without her. And that, more than anything, was what finally broke her.
The road back to Seattle felt longer than it had been on the way down. The rain had stopped, but the sky remained overcast, that muted gray that seemed to swallow color, light, and warmth. Olivia drove in silence, the hum of the tires on wet asphalt filling the spaces her thoughts couldn't. Daniel's voice replayed in her mind, steady and unyielding. That man died the day you lied. For years, she'd imagined this meeting as a kind of absolution. She thought if she could look him in the eye, if she could finally tell the truth, some weight inside her would lift. Instead, the truth had shattered her in ways she hadn't prepared for. Forgiveness hadn't come. It wasn't his to give anymore. It was hers to face. When she arrived home, the apartment felt smaller, emptier. The city lights outside painted faint reflections across her window, fragments of other lives that went on without her. She set her bag down, kicked off her heels, and collapsed onto the couch. For a long while, she just sat there, staring at the ceiling, at the dust motes drifting through the air, at nothing at all. The next morning, she called Marcus. I found him, she said. Her voice was barely more than a whisper. I know, he replied. I've figured by the silence. Do you believe people can change, Marcus? He paused before answering. People can understand. That's not the same thing. Olivia closed her eyes. Then maybe that's all I get. After the call, she pulled out her laptop and opened a blank document. For years, her work in corporate communications had been about controlling narratives, rewriting reality into something palatable. Now, she wanted none of that. She began to type, not a statement, not an apology, but a confession. She wrote everything,
The lies she told about Daniel to protect herself, the way she'd manipulated HR, the years of silence and guilt that followed. It wasn't for him anymore. It was for the version of herself she could no longer live with. Hours passed. The words flowed like blood from an open wound. By the time she finished, the city had gone dark again. She saved the document, printed a copy, and slipped it into an envelope, marked, "To whom it may concern, the truth." The next day, she drove to her old firm, the same one that had fired Daniel all those years ago. The receptionist blinked in surprise when she saw her. "Miss Reed, I didn't know you were visiting." "I'm not visiting," Olivia said quietly. "I'm closing a chapter."
She asked to speak with the board's legal team, left the envelope in their hands, and walked out before they could ask questions. She didn't need their judgment. She'd already served her sentence, in memory, in guilt, in the slow corrosion of her own soul. Outside, the winter air bit at her face. For the first time in years, she felt something close to clarity. But reckoning wasn't just about facing the past. It was about living with what came after. That night, she returned home to an empty apartment. She poured herself a glass of wine, though it tasted more bitter than she remembered. She thought of Daniel, somewhere in that quiet Oregon town, teaching, building, maybe laughing. She hoped he was at peace. He deserved that much. Her phone buzzed, an email notification. She hesitated before opening it. The subject line was blank, but the sender's name made her heart skip. Daniel Harper. The message was short, just a few sentences. "Olivia, I read the letter you left me. I don't know if it changes anything, but I wanted you to know something. You weren't the only one who lied. I told myself leaving was punishment for you, but it was really escape for me. I couldn't face what we'd both become. Don't look for me again. You've done what you needed to do. Now learn to live with it. Daniel." Her eyes blurred as she read it again and again. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't even closure. It was acknowledgement. Raw, unvarnished truth, just like she'd wanted. Olivia set the phone down and stared out the window. The city glowed beneath a thin mist, alive and indifferent. Somewhere out there, people were falling in love, betraying each other, starting over. The cycle never stopped. She thought about the meaning of reckoning. It wasn't vengeance or confession or even redemption. It was the quiet moment when all debts, emotional, moral, spiritual, come due. And in that moment, you decide whether to keep running or finally stand still. For the first time, Olivia chose to stand still. She walked to her balcony, the winter air crisp against her skin. Below, traffic flowed like veins of light through the city. She thought of the first time she met Daniel at a company party under a sky full of cheap fairy lights. The memory felt distant, almost fictional now. "I'm sorry," she whispered again, not to him, but to the wind, to the part of herself that once believed love could survive lies. Inside, the printer hummed softly. She turned back toward it, feeding in blank paper. She didn't know what she'd write next, only that she would keep writing, not to erase the past, but to understand it. Because reckoning wasn't an ending. It was the long, slow beginning of living honestly, with others and with herself. As dawn began to pale the horizon, Olivia finally closed her eyes. For the first time in years, the silence didn't feel like punishment. It felt like peace.